Hi, it's Dean Homeuni, and as we continue our journey, we're now going to enter part two of image stabilization. Down on the files that we have you downloaded as part of this lesson plan, I'm going to bring up Explorer, and we have a couple files which are actually going to be in the Lesson 4 folder and Lesson Set 4. So I really have four files here: a Lesson 3 left eye, Lesson 3 right eye, Lesson 3 side by side, and a Lesson 3. And I'll explain these four files and then we'll bring them in. Lesson 3 is a file which has not had stabilization applied to it. And this is a file that we're going to be swimming along the reef, and therefore we're going to use the Adobe Warp Stabilizer. Lesson 3 side by side is a file that has been stabilized using Adobe Warp Stabilizer, and we're going to see some problems on there by rendering out as a side-by-side view that we've been doing with the other files about the leakage problem we have on the screen. We'll go over that. Then we have a Lesson 3 right eye and a Lesson 3 left eye. This is film which has been stabilized using Adobe Warp Stabilizer, and we're going to bring that in and show that if we do two separate renders, one for the left eye and one for the right eye versus the side-by-side, we're not going to have those leakage problems. So let's go ahead and highlight all four of these files and drag them into our asset plane. We're going to use under film that we're going to create another bin because we want to keep our stuff organized. And if you do this as you're going along in your project, before you know it, you have a really good organized structure and you can find your assets. So I'm going to come in on the bin. So we'll click here. I accidentally hit it twice. So once again, I can just come here and say clear. I'll come back to this bin and just hit rename, and I'll go Lesson 4. Once you have that created, let's take these four files, and you can highlight them all by holding down the shift key, or you can bring one in at a time, or you can highlight the files you want to bring in by holding the shift key on a PC and dragging them. And our next thing we're going to do is go under sequences. We'll highlight that. Let's create another sequence called Lesson 4. File, new, sequence. And then we'll call this Lesson 4. That brings it up down on the timeline, and we can just exit out of Lesson 3. So I want us to take the Lesson 3 file and drag it into the Lesson 4 sequence. And within here, of course, as always, this was a rendered left-right eye. We'll bring the quick S3D plugin from Vision 3 Imaging Inc. Go ahead and set it on the left eye. So we're sitting in there editing the way that we've been doing so far on all the procedures. And let's, under Video Effects, go find under Distort, which is where the Adobe Warp Stabilizer is. Under Video Effects, Distort, Warp Stabilizer. We'll bring that, we'll drag it onto our plane, onto the piece of film. This is going to analyze for a couple minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and I'll come back once it's done analyzing. The computer has finished analyzing the film using the Warp Stabilizer, and therefore we'll go through what these commands are. We use Warp Stabilizer, which is a standard part of Adobe Premiere Pro, to analyze the scenes as we're swimming along the reef, i.e. non-tripod shots. Boris Continuum Complete image stabilization has the same sort of tool. It's just that I feel Adobe works a little better and it's a standard part of the product. What you have to be careful of is that this command, when it comes in, is defined and set to subspace, warp. And you don't want it there. You want it to be on position, scale, rotation, and it does come in automatically on stabilize, crop, and auto scale. What that means is that it's going to go through and analyze the pixels. It's going to crop the edges, because what it's going to do is move it forward, either move it forward or move it backwards. And if it moved it backwards, you're going to have edges on the film, and it's going to auto scale the film itself to wind up automatically filling up the entire screen, so you're at 1920 by 1080. It runs through these particular processes, and because we changed this position, scale, rotation, we went back and forth to subspace, it reanalyzed it. Let's take a look when we say that what it's going to do is move the film or crop it. If I turn the warp stabilizer on and off, I just turned it off, turned it on. See how the film comes forward? And we said as part of the analyzation, it makes an analysis and then winds up cropping the footage. And when you go through and do these analyses, sometimes the cropping will be too much and not acceptable. And that's part of the artistic analysis that you're going to do as an artist. Let's go ahead and try to make this film a little bigger so we can see what it's like without any warp stabilization on. And just for you all to know, this is film that I brought back from the Grand Caymans. I went on a 16-day filming trip to the Grand Caymans in Bonaire. The fish there were fantastic, as you're going to see in the scene. But I want you all to notice, I was filming here at about 30, 35 feet. The coral, because the Grand Caymans gets whacked by hurricanes, a lot of the coral had been stripped, especially at these lower depths. But the fish were fantastic. Later on, it may be another lesson that we'll see some scenes from Bonaire where the coral is just unbelievable on the 2 Reefs I film on untouched, but they don't have as many fish. Let's just go ahead and look at this piece of film. It's about a minute long. Let me see if I can get it to play on full. So we can see when we're watching this film, I was getting pushed around by the currents. My camcorder is really kind of moving all over the place. But one of the things I do when I film, when I have scenes like this, that it's packed with fish, I try to save these scenes. The Grand Caymans, every single reef I was on was not like this. So don't think that the entire experience, that if you go to the Grand Caymans, will be packed with fish like this. It was not like this. These were scenes that I filmed it out a lot of fish. And the one thing about the Grand Caymans was it was $130 for 2 tanks versus Bonaire. I can do unlimited shore diving for $175 a week. So I want you to also consider that when we actually talk in the book that Bonaire hands down is the best place for underwater filming for a couple reasons. One, the reefs start in really shallow water, and 2, the diving is also cheap. So as part of this film, I'll go back that we can see that the camera, I'm going along the reef, I'm not really swimming, I'm just going with the current, but that's causing the camera to sway back and forth, and therefore we're kind of all over the place, and we want something that's going to make it a little smoother, especially on the up and down actions, and that's where this Adobe warp stabilizer under the distort category comes into play. I'm going to go ahead and stop the film. I think we understand what the issues are. Let's go ahead and now go back and bring in this side-by-side film. And this is where I've already done a render, and on this render I applied the warp stabilizer effect to it so you wouldn't have to wait around for that to be rendered. And by the way, during that render it was maxing out my CPU at 99%. This effect on, because it's CPU intensive, it maxed out my i7-3936 core, and that's one of the reasons why we recommend a dual Xenon processor, because it will speed up these particular effects that rely upon the GPU. Can wade through this thing, but on an hour film, the render is going to be well in excess of 40 hours. That's just something you have to be prepared for. I'm going to once again drag my Vision 3 Imaging Inc. S3D plugin on here, and I'm going to go ahead and wind up setting it to the left eye. So we're here, here's our left eye, and we're going to notice the same problem using the Adobe Warp Stabilizer as we did under the Boris Continuum Complete Optical Stabilizer. And I want you to pay attention to the right-hand side of the screen, and you're going to notice leakage. Let's go ahead and play the film. So we can see that film from the other eye leaking. There it was. Did you see it? You see it? There it is. It's leaking. There it was. See it right there? Okay, so you can see the film leaking on here, that when we render a left-right eye, the optical stabilizer is not working. It's not stabilizing the film, and all that's going on is the film is floating all over the place, and that causes a problem. We know now that it's just not an issue with Boris Continuum Complete. It's an issue also with the Adobe Warp Stabilizer, and therefore we had to come up with some other solution. So I'm going to stop the film. Now what I did was I did a render once I applied the effect to the first film. I came along and did a render where I rendered a left eye and a right eye. And the way that you bring two separate eyes in and use the Quick S3D plugin, you take your left eye, and when I render it, I went lesson 3/left eye, and you actually bring that into video track 2. And here you can see video 1 and video 2. And you now bring the lesson 3 right eye and you bring it in to video track 1. These are the two video tracks associated with those, but there's nothing on them. When we have a left-right eye, we have to set up the Quick S3D plugin a little differently, and we're going to go through that right now. So we're going to grab the plugin, we bring it to video track 2, which holds our left eye, and we drop it. Then we actually come along, we have a button here called primary layer. Click on the primary layer, and you're actually going to set that to none. Once again, the primary layer to none. You hit the little down arrow next to the secondary layer, and you set that to video track 1. After you have the secondary layer, or the right eye, which is in video track 1, set to the chosen layer as video 1, you're ready to rock and roll. Under here, if I go back up and I go side by side, there's our film that we've been looking at, some of these rendered 3D clips coming in, but I'll just go to the left as if we're editing 2D film. What I want us to do is I'm going to play this file, and we rendered a separate left-right eye, and I want you to look at this right-hand side again, and you're going to notice there's no leakage. So let's go ahead and play it. Go ahead and stop it. So for whatever reason, whether there is an issue with the Quick S3D plugin, the way that it's handling the film, or an issue with the warp stabilizer and also the optical stabilizer, if you render a left-right eye to only have that one strip of film using this plugin, you're going to get the leakage. And let's go back again. We'll see our leakage coming over here on the right. And guess what? The effect or the stabilization doesn't work. But when you have this piece of film and you're applying the warp stabilizer to it, you're going to have to render a separate left and right eye. The way that you do that is you click on the down arrow on the Quick S3D and you put a left eye and you render it. And then after that's done, you come into the right eye and you'll notice the shift in the film. Let's take a look at that again. Here's your left eye, and here's our right eye. You notice that shift in the film. You'll have to render the right eye. Now, the problem here is that this effect, both the optical stabilizer from Boris Continuum Complete and the warp stabilizer from Adobe, these are CPU extensive effects that have to go through pixel by pixel to analyze where those pixels should have been. And this is one of, if not the most computational intensive effect which we utilize, and it takes a lot of time to run the effect. So unfortunately, there is an issue regarding on one of the effects, which is one of the longest rendering effects, and on an hour movie, even on my box, it takes well over 40 hours to just do this one effect. Down in our guide, we had render step number 2, where we had this as a separate render. And now you understand why this is a separate render, because you're going to do separate left and right eyes. And once you're through this particular item, you're over the hump, and we're really ready to start rocking at that point. I just wanted to, once again, show you one of the issues that the Adobe Warp Stabilizer will make the film smoother going along the reef. And that's something to pay attention to. But on this one effect, you have to make sure that you render a separate left and right eye. That's the end of our tutorials on the optical stabilization tools, where we use the tripod. On a tripod, we use Boris Continuum Complete Optical Stabilizer, and on the shot swimming along the reef, we use the Adobe Warp Stabilizer, even though you can use the BCC optical stabilizer for all these stabilization routines, and you can use the Adobe stabilizer product for also tripod shots. But I just think, so in other words, to do a tripod shot, you would do no motion. It would just be in here. But like I said, a no motion shot is only for a tripod. I mean, if we try a no motion on this film right here, I'll show you what's going to happen. In fact, that's a nice little point to go over. So I'm going to go no motion, and it's going to stabilize, and we're going to have to just wait a second. You're going to see that it's going to zoom so far in that the no motion routine is unusable when you're swimming along the reef, because the idea is the camera thinks that you have, the program thinks you have no motion going on at all, i.e. you're filming on a tripod, and all of a sudden you're all over the place. We can see what happened to the film when we try to do a no motion swimming along the reef line. It just doesn't work. We'll go back to smooth motion, and it does this stabilization. You have to wait around. That's why I like the Boris Continuum Complete product a little better. Once you go through the analysis and you start using all these different controls, you don't have this stabilizing routine comes up that you have to wait a minute to 2 minutes for it to make a determination of where it should be again. On the Boris optical stabilization, once it does its analysis, you can go switching through all these different type of routines immediately. The three major points are here that when you do your stabilization routines using Boris on the tripod, Adobe Warp Stabilizer on swimming along the reef, you have to change this thing from subspace warp to position, scale, and rotation, and it defaults to stabilize, crop, and auto scale, and that's where you want this control to be. That's the end of our lessons on optical stabilization. Make sure to use them. They make your film look a lot more professional. And even after using these tools, if your film is all over the place, then you have to make a decision whether you just want to wind up cutting that entire clip, because it's not going to match the quality of the rest of the film.